And I'd like to invite all of our speakers on stage so we can dig in and double down on a few topics that we've chatted about today. Unfortunately, Maura had to drop for an urgent meeting, but we will certainly share our discussions with her. So Chad, Daniel, Benjamin. Okay, you're here. Nice. Awesome. So I think every data quality meetup, we have a certain kind of a theme that is a common thread between multiple lightning talks. And I think today there was a lot of conversations around sort of like smarter semantic data, metrics, ERDs. So I'd love to really dive into that, because not only here, but what we're seeing in the industry is that we have multiple attempts to really rethink how to abstract business logic, how to maybe invent something better than SQL. So Oliver mentioned Malloy, which is the new project by Looker co-founders. There is also some SQL sort of abstraction layers that focus more on data science. There are metric platforms built specifically to kind of compute metrics. We also see solutions like dbt that originally focused on structuring SQL queries and helping data engineers or analytics engineers define and build reliable SQL pipelines, are now also start to think about introducing metric layers to go on top. And so I think the interesting challenge that I haven't really wrapped my head around was that you have these SQL workflows like dbt, right? And you think that, well, okay, maybe the right place for me to define the business logic is there. And then on the other hand, you have those BI tools like, for example, Looker or let's say Lightdash, right? That are also quite rich in their ability to express or define metrics. And so what is the right place to define the business logic? Is there any like line in the sand that we can draw? Like, what is the best practice there? Or do we need a third tool that would not be our ELT framework like dbt, would not be our BI tool like Looker, that would then contain all those metrics and serve them everywhere? I think this is, at least for me, it's like a very big open question that I'm trying to understand. So would really love to hear everyone's thoughts.
I can chime in a little bit on how we think about this at Convoy, and then I'd like to pass it off to Daniel, because he's been working on this problem a lot as well. So when we've traditionally thought about metrics, we definitely wanted to abstract them, and abstract them like fundamentally far enough away from data modeling tools like dbt. Because in terms of the stakeholders who care about metrics, it's a lot more than just your data scientist or your analyst. At Convoy, you have ops managers who know very little SQL who care about metrics. There are product managers who care a huge amount about metrics. There's managers who care a lot about metrics. Even executives care about metrics. And the ideal sort of definition surface for us would be something that is version controlled, Git based, but you have the same sort of like ownership parameters and governance parameters as like sort of any other like first class data entity. So we actually built a metrics repository internally that's built on GitHub. It's pretty naive at the moment, and Daniel can talk about this more. But the goal is to abstract away the concept of like a business definition of a metric, and allow there to be some like description and like some semantic meaning of it, and then have a way for that that definition to evolve naturally over time as like different actors want to make changes to it. So Daniel, maybe you'd want to spend just a minute or two talking about like where we are, and then sort of how that thinking maybe is evolving.
Yeah. So we originally actually leveraged dbt in helping to create like the metrics layer using kind of the structure that dbt provides in order for people to define SQL queries, and those represent metrics. It effectively represents this layer, not quite down at the source kind of table level, but not high enough at the BI level. It's this kind of layer in the middle that we designed so we can talk to experimentation and we can talk to reporting systems. I think as we had an initial implementation of it, and what we've seen is we really want to make it easy and accessible for anybody at the company to like continue to make changes, which is a theme in Chassis as well. And also really streamline the tools that we use for creating metrics that provide like instant feedback on like, what's this metric going to look like? What are the transformations and things like that. So, yeah.
So if I understand correctly, is there some sort of like a domain specific language that you have in the platform that helps you define those metrics on top of like those entities that you build, or is it still SQL, just maybe somewhat abstracted away from the sort of messy data prep that happens in dbt?
Yeah, so it's still SQL, and then that SQL is effectively marked up to say like the resulting data that is produced by this query, like what do these things actually mean, and we tie these back to like semantic entities and events and stuff like that. Yeah.
Oh, very interesting.
So that's really curious, and I think that like kind of hits the nail on the head for the metrics, is that they have to be meaningful to everyone, and also everyone needs a way to contribute. And also kind of under the hood, like why not make it SQL? Because like choosing anything else just makes your life much more difficult. Like we like 6 months ago, we decided it would be great to have metrics in dbt. So it's really cool. It's like interesting to hear the other point that it's better for people not to have to get involved with dbt to do it. The pattern that we were seeing, which might not be true at all organizations, was people who wanted to define metrics maybe didn't have the necessary skills. And this is about data culture, because it sounded like Chad and Daniel mentioned that people were self-serving on dbt models as well. So it sounds like in Convoy, there's like an awesome data culture of people having good data skills and being able to self-serve. Like sadly, it's also not the case everywhere. So usually the central data team ends up being responsible for maintaining the metrics. So one pro about having it in dbt, having it close to the transformation logic, is like that's where the modern data analysts are today. Like these are the tools they hang out in. This is where they feel comfortable. So like marking up and maintaining the metrics there is really cool. I actually agree. If you have a way for business users to maintain those definitions and contribute, then actually I can see that doing that inside of dbt, that's a lot of additional complexity that they don't want to handle. So that's actually really curious.
And so Oliver, so for someone curious about Lightdash, how do you approach the problem? Do you actually define, like, do you assume that you connect to some sort of a data model and then you kind of compute metrics on the fly? Do you define them in Lightdash, or do you define them in dbt? So what is the philosophy that you follow in your product?
Yeah, so the philosophy for us was write them in dbt, make it as thin of a layer as possible on top of the models and on top of the SQL. So push work to dbt where possible. We can manage transformations well, so let's keep doing it. And I was consulting in data before Lightdash, and we saw like some Looker repos get really, really messy. A lot of business logic scattered there, whereas kind of data teams tend to keep their transforms nice and tidy and version controlled. So yeah, the philosophy was keep the metrics layer thin, and that for most data teams, they probably would prefer to maintain that like inside of dbt. And now dbt's actually announced that they're elevating metrics. We kind of existed in this meta tag in dbt, which is kind of like a free-for-all YAML structure. So we injected metric definitions there. dbt have now announced that they're going to kind of upgrade that to a more sort of like first-party entity, which is pretty exciting. So it seems like there's appetite there. I think the one thing I always say about the metrics layer and about all these different implementations that are cropping up is like the benefit of metrics, which Chad and Daniel said, is that the rest of the business can self-serve. So you can build like a really good user experience on top of it. And my fear sometimes at the moment is that like if the metrics layer becomes too generic, it'll be something that more serves the technical teams and doesn't enable us to build really good data experiences on top of it. So there's this like push and pull where like we want it to be really easy for the technical teams to maintain, but simultaneously needs to be opinionated enough to build like data user experiences on top of it. So yeah, it's a hodgepodge at the moment.
Awesome. Benjamin, also curious to hear your point of view here, probably speaking from the largest data scale among all our speakers, right, with Yelp. So curious how, and also I think just as a company and as a sort of data platform, Yelp probably spans, I don't know how many years, right? Probably more than 10, I think. So how that thinking about sort of source of truth, sort of reusable metrics evolved, and how that affects maybe your team's work.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm definitely coming at it from a little bit different perspective than the rest of this group. I'm not actually on a data team, but I ingest the work of data teams. And it's interesting to hear you talk about adding this like intermediate layer, because like we definitely have a love-hate relationship with that intermediate layer. I mean, even just the example, Oliver, that you showed about like in Brazil means that the lower dot locale equals BR. I feel like any one of these decisions has like a lot of, especially corner cases that might come up. And what ends up happening when we look at these sort of more generic metrics, as opposed to like looking at the lowest level, we start to build up an imagination of, I think this is what that means when they say in Brazil, but actually, at the edge, like it might be wrong. And sometimes those edge cases can bite you. So I guess that's just my plea to your side, that I know that there is a tendency to start to add abstractions and make things simpler and easier for people to understand. But if you do that too much, then there's too much of a gap between the people that are using the data and the people that are defining the data, and that you could really, like we've seen it a number of times in various ways, that you can get yourself confused and you can try to be aiming for something when actually you're ending up in a totally different direction.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point of maybe tension, because I think data teams are now pulled in the directions where they're not just serving analytics, but data is now reused in the production, right? What we've seen with Benjamin, your talk, and I think that creates a lot of pressure to basically, well, not only maintain the infrastructure and do all the computations, but also have, build tools for how those computations are defined and then reused within the organization. So it's a lot of, I think the scope of data teams' work right now is massively getting increased. And it's going to be interesting how that is, like, what is the reaction of organizations and with tooling as well, right? Because even with the metrics platforms that we've seen appearing on the market, some were focused on sort of like, oh, we're just going to give data as an API, basically, metric by dimensions in the JSON format. Some of them were more focused on kind of maintaining the kind of full compatibility with SQL. And I don't think there is yet a really consensus of what is the model that works best. And I think probably we won't come to an answer here with this panel, just given how hairy and big the problem is. But it's really interesting to hear everyone's points of view, right? So the teams building tools internally, teams building tools for others, and the perspective of engineers who actually have to consume some of those metrics and ensure, high availability SLAs. So we are at time, and sadly, I won't go into further questions just yet. We'll leave them for another meetup. I wanted to say huge thanks to all of you, all our speakers who contributed time to talk about your awesome work. I think I personally learned a lot, and I think that everyone who participated have done so as well. And thanks to everyone who dialed in today from all over the world. And we will also share the recordings of the talks and the digests with all the participants and all the speakers, so they can also reshare it within your networks. And we're looking forward to seeing everyone at our future meetups. Thank you, and bye.